In 1952, a public balloon program known as Moby Dick was started by United States Air Force to study the high-altitude wind currents. Through trials when balloon payloads were lifted up in Holloman Air Force Base, New Mexico and tracked across the continental United States, they discovered that tropospheric jet streams meander west to east, meaning that balloons released from West Europe would hypothetically fly over the USSR toward U.S. military bases in Japan. Aside from the data obtained on winds patterns, this program would serve in the future as a cover for the spying effort. But flight at this altitude posed its own challenges. To cope with temperatures of -70 degrees Fahrenheit, the balloons employed a special polyethylene that wouldn't crack in the cold. Altitude was a critical detail, because in addition to taking advantage of the jet stream, balloons cruising at 50,000 feet were hypothetically out of reach of Soviet air defenses. Genetrix was the code name of a secret program carried out in 1956 by the United States Strategic Air Command to obtain photographic and electronic reconnaissance of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and its satellites. Genetrix's original plan envisioned the launch of near 2,500 stratospheric balloons carrying camera gondolas from several sites in Europe and Middle East. The balloons would drift across the Soviet Union on the winter jet stream, covering nearly all of the Soviet land mass. Once outside Russian airspace, the gondolas would be cut free of the balloons by radio signals, and while descending in parachute, they would be caught in midair or from the water by specially equipped planes. The payload developed for the program was designated WS-119L. Aside rigging, parachutes, electronic gear and ballast boxes, the heart of the system was the DMQ-1 photographic reconnaissance package. It was a duplex camera which had two 6-inch lenses on opposite sides at a 34.5 degrees angle to the horizon. The camera was capable of obtaining about 500 pictures using film of 9 inches square, covering 50 miles on either side of the balloon path. A secondary 16mm gun camera was used to take pictures that indicated balloon's altitude, azimuth and a wide-angle view of the ground, showing its general geographic location for later analysis and overlapping of the images. The system was enclosed in a fiberglass box measuring 36 by 30 by 57 inches lined with 6 inches of styrofoam for insulation. On the bottom of the box a photocell turned on and off the camera according to the illumination below. Grand Union was the code name of the logistical effort performed to deploy all the units taking part of the program to their destination areas. Although preliminary work for material deployment started before the training phase, the first unit to be transported to the operations theater was the 6,926th Radio Squadron, in charge of tracking the balloons once they cleared Soviet territory. They departed in June to where the tracking detachments were located: Shiroi, Yontan and Chitose Air Bases in Japan, Northwest Field, Guam, Wake Island, Clark Air Force Bases in the Philippines, Pyeongtaek Air Base, Korea, Midway and finally at Shemya Island in the Aleutians and Elmendorf in Alaska. Once the tracking sites were set up in September, crews at Chitose, Japan, and Kadena Air Bases, Okinawa, started to launch transmitter-equipped balloons. Under the code name of Moby Dick Far East, the operation would provide training in balloon tracking operations and also would serve to the program's cover. Launch operations then moved from Okinawa to K6 Air Base in Korea to obtain routes similar to those to be followed by the spy balloons. The 1110th Air Support Group also departed in October to their destinations. Initially, it was considered that all balloons should be launched from Scotland, but adding to the typical bad weather in the region, a further study indicated that more complete coverage could be obtained if sites were wide dispersed in Western Europe. The launch sites chosen were Eventon in Scotland, Gardermoen in Norway, Giebelstad and Oberpfaffenhofen in Germany and Adana Air Bases in Turkey. The deployment phase ended in December after moving £32 million of equipment. This also marked another change in the reconnaissance program, which received its final and definitive code name, Genetrix, in early January 1956. The program received the go-ahead from President Eisenhower. The first step before beginning the Genetrix launches was to put the cover plan into action. Orders were issued to start an early January Operation White Cloud, whose objective was to launch balloons from sites in Okinawa, Hawaii, and Alaska. Carrying out the two programs at the same time, Strategic Air Command sought to blur the boundaries between them. The first balloon was launched from Kadena Air Base on January 9, receiving press coverage on which U.S. Air Force informed that the Moby Dick program was being extended to Europe and Far East, and the balloons would transport meteorological instruments and cameras to photograph clouds. The first wave of Genetrix was sent aloft the following day, January 10. That day, 8 balloons were launched from Turkey, and one from the Giebelstadt airfield in Germany, with initial orders of sending them at a maximum rate of 10 by day and by site. The other sites soon joined, Oberpfaffenhofen and Eventon on January 11 and Gardermoen on January 13. Starting the second week of operations, the Soviet defenses commenced to be more effective intercepting the balloons, reducing drastically the number of gondolas which arrived to the Pacific Ocean. MiG fighter pilots learned that they could target the balloons at sunrise when they would dip into shooting range, because the lifting gas would cool at night and become denser, reducing lift and causing balloons to descend to lower altitudes. To counteract this, the daily quotas of launches were raised to 30 per day on January 25 and then to 43 days later. Despite the increase, none balloon succeeded in exiting Soviet territory between January 26 and January 30. Numerous balloons were shot down by the Soviets or blown off course. Although the Soviets were well aware of the origin and purpose of the balloons, after analyzing a few recovered gondolas, they remained silent during January. Then, on February 4, Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko handed a protest note to the U.S. ambassador in Moscow about the gross violation of Soviet airspace. As a result of the protest and the scarce amount of balloons that entered the recovery zone that last week, President Eisenhower ordered on February 6 to stop the balloon launches and instructed accordingly to the Air Force to halt the operations. The only part of Genetrix allowed to continue was the search and recovery of gondolas that could be found in subsequent weeks. The operation that was planned to span until almost June endured only 27 days. During the operational period, 516 balloon systems were launched, but only 67 entered the recovery area. 57 of these were terminated and 44 of them were recovered. Regarding the primary mission, the total number of gondolas from which were obtained images were 40. The total number of usable exposures was 13,813, which covered 1,100,000 square miles or 9% of the USSR and China. The only finding of significance was the discovery of a vast nuclear refining facility at Dodanovo in Siberia. Despite this limitation, Genetrix images were some of the best and most complete photography obtained of the Soviet Union after the World War II and before the satellite era. It was referred to as pioneer photography because it provided a baseline for all future overhead photography. Even photos of common things as forests and streams proved valuable in later years when U-2 spy plane and satellite photography revealed construction activity in the same places. Also, the accurate record of high-altitude wind currents derived from the tracking of the balloons would help to determine optimum flight paths for U-2 overflights.